All right, this is the last video for Module 21 having to do with the multiplier and fiscal policy. Now this is, I think, one area that your book doesn't really go into enough detail and doesn't have you practice enough. So I do have a couple of things on here to practice that, how the multiplier affects fiscal policy, but I also have a practice worksheet that I gave out in class on Canvas that I encourage you to take a look at as well. So, first of all, the multiplier and fiscal policy. Keep in mind that just like when we talked about the multiplier with consumer spending, the multiplier also affects government spending and how much it will change GDP. So a change in government spending, okay, is going to be multiplied by the multiplier to determine the change in GDP. This is the same thing as when in class I gave a student $100 at the beginning of the unit, right? And I gave that student $100 and that student had to spend some and save some. And what they spent went on to the next person who then also got that as income and had to spend some and save some. And it goes on down the line, and we basically have this snowball domino effect, right? With government spending, we have the same issue, where we basically have the government's going to be spending some, and so they're going to be spending this amount of money on whatever it is they're spending it on, and that's going to be income for somebody else who's going to then spend some and save some, and as a result, it just keeps on going down the line. So that doesn't matter if we're talking about consumer spending, where we're talking about, going to the mall and, buying, more clothes, or if we're talking about government spending where, for example, we have a construction project and they're building another building. Now, the controversial part, obviously, is what are they spending it on? But that's for government, not for us. So, here's an example for you. This is the part where I say that your book didn't really have enough practice for you, but I have seen this as an example in a AP test. So this is why I am showing this to you. So here's this graph. So automatically when you look at this, what type of gap is this? Recessionary or inflationary? Hopefully you said recessionary, because our equilibrium is to the left of our long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, here's where this gets interesting, because now we actually have numbers on the bottom. So now we know that the long-run aggregate supply curve, the output is at $100 billion. So that means that our full employment, when we are at the natural rate of unemployment and we are producing as much as possible, we are making $100 billion in real GDP. However, currently we are at $60 billion. So yes, we are in a recession. Now, the question is, okay, the government wants to fix this, so they're going to do some sort of fiscal policy to be able to move our aggregate demand curve to the right. So that's essentially what we want to do, so that we eventually get to this point here and we get to our full potential. So let's ignore taxes and transfer payments for a minute, and let's just assume that they're going to do government spending. Okay, so the question is, how much should the government increase spending by to close the gap of the recessionary gap here? Which, by the way, for some reason this didn't work out right. It said to say if the MPC is 0.5, not 5. So my point, for some reason, got left on the first line. So if the MPC is 0.5, how much does the government spending need to increase to close the gap? So let's say, for example, I've had people that make the suggestion of, let's say that we're going to increase the government spending by $40 billion. Why do they suggest that? Well, here's what happens. $40 billion is exactly what our gap is. So 100 billion minus 60 billion, say, well, let's just increase spending by $40 billion. Okay, here's the thing though. Remember, we said the government spending will be multiplied by whatever the multiplier is. So what's the multiplier? Well, remember, our multiplier is going to be 1 over 1 minus MPC. And I just said MPC is 0.5. So 1 over 1 minus 0.5. So essentially what we're saying is that this is going to be 1 over 0.5. Now, to figure out the multiplier, I will tell you this, is that it's easier if you convert your decimal here into a fraction. So what's a fraction for 0.5? Half, right? So now you don't need a calculator. Okay, so 1 over 1/2, which is equal to our multiplier, is 2. Okay, so if our multiplier is 2, that means we're going to take whatever spending the government does and multiply it by 2, because every time they spend, there's going to be income for somebody else, where they're going to save some and spend some, and the next round save some, spend some, and save some, spend some, and all the way around. So we're taking 2 times whatever the government spends. So if we did $40 billion, we'd have to multiply it by 2. And so then what would happen is we'd have actually $80 billion is how much our GDP would increase by. So this would be bad, because what would happen? It would go and overshoot our aggregate demand curve, and we'd end up with an inflationary gap over here. And what would happen is that we'd have 80 over here, and here would be our new equilibrium right here. Okay, and so that would be a way big overshot. So what we need to do is that, okay, we can't do that. So what do we need to do? If that's not going to work, we want to close the gap, and we just want to hit $40 billion is how much our increase is. So essentially what we're saying is that we want to increase our total spending by $40 billion. That's our end result. That's what we want. Okay? And we know that any change in government spending, so any change in government spending is going to be multiplied by the multiplier. So in this case, our multiplier is 2. So as a result, to figure out how much the government spending needs to change by, we need to basically take our 40 divided by 2. So our actual answer for this is going to be $20 billion. How about you try this? I changed it. If the MPC is 0.8, how much does the government spending need to increase to close the gap? So pause this, see if you can figure it out. Start with your multiplier, figure out your multiplier, and then figure out how much our government spending needs to increase by. Okay. Did you figure out $8 billion? Because if you did our equation for the multiplier, 1 over 1 minus 0.8 is going to be 1 over 0.2, and 0.2 as a fraction is 1/5. So our multiplier is 5. So we want our GDP to increase by $40 billion, and our multiplier is 5. So we're taking 40 divided by 5, which is $8 billion. Okay, now, here's the problem is that sometimes they don't want to change government spending. Okay, so let's change some transfer payments and taxes. But here's the problem with transfer payments and taxes. They have a smaller effect on GDP than they do than government spending does. Here's the reason why. Okay, so I love this. I saw lots of these signs during when they sent out those stimulus checks in 2008. The reason why is that consumers are going to receive more transfer payments, and only some of it will initially be spent, with additional rounds of spending being smaller as well, because they're going to save some of it. You're basically going to send them, for example, that stimulus check. Okay, they send out the stimulus check. I get this check in the mail. Well, gee, I don't want to spend it all. I'm only going to take some of it, and I'm going to spend some of it. I'm going to save some of the rest. Okay, great. But then the problem is that initial spending is going to be less than if the government had just spent all of it themselves. Okay, so this cartoon in your book was actually very pointed. It says, "What will you do with your stimulus check?" It says, "Stock up on rice," as a joke, considering a lot of different things. "Bury it in the backyard." Buy 2 gallons of gas. Remember, gas prices were really high at that time. Spruce up the yard. Notice it says foreclosure because the housing market was crap then. It says, or save it. And the guy says, what are you, nuts? This is America we're talking about. So obviously, we spend most of it. We save very little. However, we do save some. So here's the thing is that you got to keep in mind that tax cuts also cause consumers to only spend some of the money, again, because they're going to save some of it. Both with transfer payments and tax cuts. It's not going to be as much of an increase as government spending because we are going to save some and spend the rest. So how can you actually determine how much taxes affect the multiplier. So taxes affect the multiplier itself because taxes are oftentimes, most taxes are dependent upon the size of GDP. So as GDP increases, i.e., in other words, we are making more money, okay, then as a result, taxes also increase because we have a graduated tax system, meaning that the more money you make, the more you're going to pay in taxes. The less money you make, the less you pay in taxes. So because of that, it is going to decrease the size of the multiplier. So now using our regular old multiplier that we talked about before when we talked about government spending is not going to work anymore, okay? Because we got to take out some of those ideas of some of those things that they're going to save money on. So looming over that increase in disposable income is the fact that you have to pay taxes on it. So now we have to talk about a tax multiplier. So a tax multiplier is going to be the MPC over the MPS. That's actually going to determine your tax multiplier. Once you determine the tax multiplier, then you can actually determine how much spending has actually changed, because you're going to take the initial change, tax change. So in other words, are we talking about, $40 billion in tax cuts? And you're going to multiply it by the tax multiplier. And that will tell you how much totally spending has changed by. In other words, how much aggregate demand is moving. So let's try an example. So taxes can affect the multiplier. This is continued. This is just a reminder. So an example. Let's go back to this. This was the same graph that I just showed you when we talked about government spending. So notice that we are still in a recessionary gap because our short-run equilibrium is to the left of our long-run aggregate supply curve. And our full potential is $100 billion. We are currently at $60 billion. So if instead of doing government spending, what if we wanted to, so we want to move our aggregate demand curve to the right to try and get here. But what if instead of increasing government spending, what if we want to decrease taxes? All right, so let's say the MPC is 0.5. How much does taxes need to decrease to close the gap? Okay, well, if we went with, for example, our last answer. So remember in our last answer we said $20 billion. All right, so if we did $20 billion is how much we're going to drop taxes by. Now, remember, you have to figure out what the tax multiplier is. And so the tax multiplier, so our tax multiplier is going to be MPC over MPS. So tax multiplier, in this case, our MPC is 0.5, so that means our MPS is also 0.5. So MPC over MPS, so 0.5 over 0.5 equals 1. Okay? So any changes in our taxes are going to be multiplied by 1. So what that means is that that $20 billion tax cut that we gave to people is only going to be multiplied by 1. So that means our aggregate demand curve is only going to be increased by $20 billion. And that's not going to work because we have a gap of $40 billion. So what do we need to do instead? So again, what we need to do instead is that we need to take a look at 40 billion is how much we want to totally increase spending by in the end. And we know that a change in taxes, okay, so a change in taxes is going to be multiplied by our tax multiplier. And we know our tax multiplier in this instance is 1. So 40 divided by 1 will tell us that we actually need to decrease taxes by $40 billion. All right, how about this? If the MPC is 0.8, how much does taxes need to decrease by to close the gap? So pause the video, see if you can figure this out. Again, start with the tax multiplier. All right, did you figure it out? So your tax multiplier, first of all, so your tax multiplier, just due to my crude method here. I'm doing tax multiplier is going to be your 0.8 divided by 0.2, which is equal to 4, right? So our tax multiplier is 4. And so as a result, we want to go and increase our spending by $40 billion. And we know that change in taxes is going to be multiplied by this case by 4. So you're going to take 40 billion divided by 4, and so hopefully you figured out that our taxes need to decrease by $10 million. All right. Now, if you need more practice with this, you can go to Canvas for extra practice. So if you go on Canvas under modules 16 through 21, underneath these video notes, so underneath module 21 notes, part 2, multiplier on the fiscal policy, which is what you are watching currently, there is this multiplier and fiscal policy practice. And if you pull this up, it does go through a couple of examples for you. I will post the answers to this after today. So I will post the answers right underneath that after today. Otherwise, let me know if you have any questions, and I will talk to you later.